Alrighty, good morning. Welcome to broadcast this morning, a beautiful spring morning. And as you can see, my pool is not blue. And I think that's because I got lazy during winter, because it's so much easier to maintain the pool during winter. And now the spring has hit me, and I've got pollen, I got leaves, I got the winds going, the rain's coming, so I need to get my act together and get it done. But anyway, as you can see, this morning I'm kidless and also without my dear wife. Tori is gone off to, Gracie has her ballet exam today, and they've gone to support her, and I'm so sad that I can't be there today, but hopefully I'll give him a video call a little bit later on to see if I can catch the tail end of that. But if you're watching with me this morning, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with us today. One more very important announcement is, guys, this Saturday coming, I'm running my first half marathon. Now, I used to run a long time ago, and then I got badly injured, and at the beginning of this year I was in Europe and I tried snowboarding and I failed miserably. Realized that I am in fact getting old and I need to do something about my fitness, and so I decided to start running again early this year. But this time I decided to do it with more wisdom. In other words, I'll run a little bit slower and build a bit of a base. Anyway, long story short, it's been 6 months I've been training for this half marathon that's coming up on Saturday, and I want to say it publicly, I want to do a sub 2 hour half marathon this weekend. So if you have any tips for me, let them come my way. I appreciate any type of race tips. It'll be my first official 21k race. Very excited. I've trained so hard. I think I've lost since January I've lost about 14k's. So I'm very excited about that. Anyway, that's coming up this week, just a little bit from my side. And then one more little thing is that unfortunately it seems like Facebook has changed some of the settings in terms of downloading videos, which means that I have been unable to download last week's broadcast and put it on YouTube. So I'm still trying to navigate through that and see what I'm going to do, how I'm going to fix it. But for the moment, I'm unable to send these broadcasts through to YouTube. So that's a pity, but I'm sure we'll find a way to get around that today. Morning once again to those who are watching, those who I can see log on. Please remember, like someone said to me this week, Frans, why don't you say hi to me when I log on? In fact, it was my mom. And I said, Mom, well, your name doesn't come up when you log on. I don't know why. Maybe you haven't liked the page. Maybe you've unfriended me on Facebook. I'm not sure. But if your name doesn't come up, I can't say hi to you. So just so you know, if you're one of those that regularly watch but you don't get a hi, I'm not sure why some people's names come up and why some people's names don't come up. So this morning I just want to say quick hi to Lynn and her parents, and also to Lucas. I see Ashley here, and then a couple of others. Welcome. And we're journeying through the book of Romans, and this morning is, I think, one of the best chapters in the book of Romans. In fact, I've gone as far, I'm going out on a limb here this morning, calling it the unified theory. Now I know that's a big word, it's a scientific term. Just to give you a little bit of background, you know, scientists have been trying to figure out how the universe works and how things work together, and we've got a handle on a lot of things, but we don't have a theory that binds everything together. We don't understand how the major forces that act in the universe, how they actually tie together and how they intertwine perfectly. We're doing our best. We're building colliders. The Hadron Collider in Switzerland is one of them, where we're trying to find a particle or a formula that can tie all of these things together, so we can say, some call it the God formula. Here's the formula that makes all of the universe work. We haven't got there yet. But I think it's an important point, because theology is very much like scientific theory. Before you throw stones at the screen, it's just simply for the fact that when we deal with science, we're always dealing in approximations according to the data we have. So for instance, gravity, when we had Newton come up with Newton's famous formulas, and specifically his formula for gravity, it was a great formula. I mean, it's genius. And if you apply it to life on Earth, it works as far as we can see perfectly. But the reality is, it's not an all-encompassing formula for gravity. Gravity does weirder things in other parts of the universe. And so although this formula of Newton is great for Earth, it's not so great when you get closer to black holes and other weird phenomena. The point being that in scientific theory, we're always dealing with approximations. We take all the data we can gather and we put it into a formula that is our best guess of what this data represents. And theology works very much in the same way. You're just here with theology. If you're a Protestant, your theology, the database for your theology is the Bible. So you use the data in the Bible to construct theories that you feel best approximate what type of things are fully true. So the Trinity, for instance, is one of those things where we've taken all the data the Bible gives us, we put it together, and after fighting for centuries about it, one specific theory prevails, the idea of the Trinity, and that's what we are handed down throughout history. And if you're a Protestant, then most likely you've been handed down the doctrine, we call them doctrines then, of the Trinity, which is our best approximation, our best approximations of the data that we find in the scriptures. But I think the most important thing we need to take from this is that we are always dealing in approximations. We are always dealing in our best interpretation of the data we're given. And so this morning I used the title Unified Theory because sometimes I do that just to be a little bit provocative. But really what I think we find here in Romans 8 is, if there is such a thing as a theological unified theory, I think this is it. I think it's found here in Romans 8 verse 18, and then it's explained in the next 20 or so verses. As a Christian growing up, we have many ideas, we have many doctrines, and even as Christians we differ on those quite widely in terms of what's going to happen in the end. Why are we here? What's the point of suffering? How did it come into being? Where are we heading as humanity? What happens to the bad? What happens to the good? And it's not my job today to bring all of those up. But I do think that what Paul describes for us here in Romans 8 verse 18 to 39 is for me it's the overarching. It's very general, but it is a great unified theory of what's busy happening to us as humanity and what does the future look like. So just in a very brief recap, we started in Romans from the first chapter and we slowly walked through each chapter. Now I've just written down half a sentence on each of the chapters. Romans 1, everyone misses the mark, Jew and Gentile, and there's consequences to missing the mark. Romans 2, even those who have the law of Moses can't get to the mark with that law. Romans 3, there is a free gift that God wants to give not only to Jews but also to Gentiles, and this is called the justification of all. Justification we define as God accepting us and embracing us in spite of where we might find ourselves, or in spite, technical term, of us being sinners or us missing the mark. Romans 4, God does not impute sin but imputes righteousness. So righteousness is just the consequence of being justified, right? It comes from the same root word, it's the same type of concept in the scriptures. Romans 5, by the righteousness of one, the free gift comes upon all of us. Speaking about Jesus, and he uses the antitype of Adam's fall, saying that, Adam was bad, Adam did something wrong, and so we all just got born into sin. You didn't have to believe in sin to become sinful. You didn't have to put up your hand and say, I confess sin, to become sinful. It was automatic dispersion, administration. At least that's how Paul puts it. But then he uses an antitype, and he says, in the same way, what Jesus did brings justification to all of us. Now, we don't need to put our hands up or say we confess it. It is automatic. It comes upon all of us. Other places, Paul would say that God reconciled the world to himself in what he did in Jesus. Romans 6 speaks about being dead to sin. In other words, not that sin doesn't exist or missing the mark doesn't exist. We miss the mark, but it can no longer separate us from the embrace and the loving embrace of God, right? Romans 7 speaks about us now also for those Jews. I mean, none of us really are Jews. None of us really lived under the law, but some of Paul's audience was. They were under the law, and Paul's saying to them, look, you no longer need, you are also dead to the law. and so that's also a chapter past. There's a newness of life. It's a new way of approaching God. The old way of approaching God in the form or in the treaty arrangement of the Torah, which you can find in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, specifically Deuteronomy, that's over, it's finished. Come to God in a new way. Come to God with a new spirit. Romans 8 is the announcement of the great news. There's no more condemnation because of Jesus, for those who are in Christ Jesus. That now partakes of a newness of life, a life that's in the Spirit, and no longer in the flesh, but in the Spirit. And therefore, he encourages us to now live after the Spirit and not after the flesh. Okay. Also, at the end of Romans 8, it says, we are no more to go back into the bondage of fear. And this is the way we used to relate to God. But we need to come to God now, and the beautiful metaphor here is we come now as children, already accepted. Even though we mess up a lot, we are accepted. Nothing can separate us in this sense. Once a child, always a child. No matter what you do, can never negate the fact that you're a child. And so that's how Romans 8 kind of concludes in verse 17, and it also speaks about us being heirs and so on. So today we jump into Romans 8:18. Verse 18, I love this verse. Let me read it and then we talk about it. Verse 18 says, for I reckon, the word reckon here is I calculate. And this is why I think theory, because it's Paul's calculation. Given all the data of Romans 1 to Romans 8:17, I make a calculation based on that data. Is actually what I'm analyzing the data and I'm creating a theory, and what Paul puts forward as the theory is this. He says, the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And I think this is it. If there's a unified theory of what life is about and where we are going and where we are coming from, this is it. It's this verse. It's telling us that even though we find ourselves right now in a place of suffering. Now, of course, Paul and them, they experience acute suffering, not only in terms of general suffering like high mortality rates, bad diseases, and life was hard back then. There was also an acute suffering of the actual Christians under very soon under Nero, and then later on we know throughout the history of Christianity lots of suffering under Roman Caesars, etc. But Paul makes this statement. This is a huge statement. He's saying that all the suffering of this present time, now it's important that he's not saying of this world, like we need to go to another world to escape the suffering. No, it's time related. And he's saying of this present time, all of the suffering is not worthy to be compared with. I want to take a moment because Paul's comparing suffering to the glory that will be revealed in us. So glory is a very religious term, and it's been used so much that it doesn't actually mean anything to any of us. Glory can mean anything from a place, if you grew up in certain circles, to having a face that shines, to being someone who now can perform miracles everywhere they go, and but ultimately glory in the New Testament is a very simple word that means a reputation of something. Many times it will be used of the glory of God, God's reputation. It speaks really to character more than it speaks to power. And I think that's what the New Testament is about. It's about revealing God's character more than God's power. And so ultimately glory, or doxa is the Greek word here. Paul is saying that there is a glory that'll come from the inside of humanity. I've written down a couple of synonyms for glory that we find in the Strong's Concordance, and listen to these words: splendor, brightness, dignity, magnificence, excellence, grace, a state, or a completeness. In other words, whatever you read into this word glory, the point here is that what God is doing inside of humanity will be so great in time to come that it will not be worth comparing with the suffering. In other words, we will not say, it's so great now, it was worth the suffering. We won't say that because that's worth comparing. What in essence, mathematically almost what he's saying that whatever is coming is so great that we will not even refer back to the suffering we went through as a humanity, as a creation. Now it's a huge statement, but it does give us an arc. It gives us the arc of history, but it also gives us the arc of the future. And we all know that humanity comes out of a lot of suffering. Creation comes out of a lot of suffering. There's a lot of suffering, not only in humanity, but also in creation. You know, I think of the little animals that are getting eaten by lions every day, and you know, that's just a very visible example of that. But there's a lot of these eons and eons of suffering that brought us, for instance, to the cross eventually. I think Paul makes a large point that whatever we've been through will not even be worth discussing in the same sentence to that what's busy happening within us. In my mind, this is a clear indicator of the direction and the fulfillment of what Christians call the new covenant. This is a verbalization of some of the expectations of the old prophets, the Jewish prophets, the major prophets, for instance, like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, who often, well, not often, but who at least speaks about something new coming. This is Paul's way of putting it into words. Now, Paul doesn't say the lion will lie with the lamb and they'll beat swords into plowshares. He doesn't give specific examples, but he does make an overarching statement that whatever is coming is so great. He calls it glory, but it's not external. It's inside of humanity. It's inside, something that's happening inside of humanity that will ultimately completely overshadow and diminish the suffering we've been through. So that's a huge statement, but it does give us an idea of what the gospel is actually about. It does give us an idea of what the good news actually brings us. And I think we need to think about this in terms of the previous chapters of Romans, that this is the result of God's justification of humanity. This is the result of God demonstrating his love and humanity realizing that they are loved regardless, and humanity starting to respond in like love, not only towards God, but also towards one another, not only towards one another, but also towards the creation itself. And that's exactly what the next couple of verses is about. It is about the creation itself. And so we're going to read those verses now. But before I go into these verses, I just want to make mention of this. It took me a long time to come to the conclusion that creation and humanity are not two separate things. Us as a humanity, we are part of creation. We are part of the universe in that sense. The stuff that makes up our body, our blood, even our mind, our thoughts. This is all natural elements that are found everywhere. The animals have brains as well. And we shouldn't see ourselves as separate, but we should see ourselves as an extension of the creation, a specific group within that creation that somehow God has gifted us with the ability of the ability of consciousness and the ability to think about what we're doing and think about consequences, think about the future, reflect on the past. But ultimately, we are really part of the creation. We are not something separate to it. And I don't want to say too much more about that, but I think that's becoming more and more obvious to most of us. But here in verse 19, I think Paul expands on the idea that the suffering we're currently going through, he will explain that as birth pains, does not compare to the glory that will be revealed in us. And this he explains as us becoming truly the children of God. So let me read King James, elaborate ways of saying, old ways of saying. I read King James. Verse 19 says the following. It says, "For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God." In other words, Paul now goes beyond just humanity, and he includes the creation. If you like, we don't only think of the creation now as just that which is on earth, because earth is such a small, absolute, negligible small part of what the universe and the creation actually looks like. So when we say creation, we think big picture. We think of that which exists. We think of matter in all its forms and its manifestations. And what Paul really is saying is that humanity has become this acute this acute, very specialized grouping of creation that is actually leading all of creation. And so he's saying that what God is doing inside of humanity has to come out and through it. It's called manifestation here, the coming out of that inner reality, and how when that comes out, it actually will affect everything around us, and creation will follow us as we move into what the Bible calls an eternal glory. He says that in verse 20, he says, for the creation was made subject to vanity. Vanity means a seeming uselessness, or a seeming uselessness is a good word. Not willingly or voluntarily, but by reason of him who subjected the same in hope. Lots of words, but basically just saying creation didn't ask to be formed in this way. We didn't ask for the suffering we are going through. But he's saying that all of this is happening with purpose. All of this happens in hope. Now this ties into what Paul says in verse 18, that the suffering can't compare with what is coming. So there's this innate hope within us that what we have today will not always be like this. What we see in humanity in our lifetime is a phase we are going through. There is a future that looks better, that looks brighter, and Paul actually calls it hope in verse 20. So you know that in another place he would say faith, hope, and love are the three things that remain for us. A complete trust in God, faith. A hope. Hope of what? Hope for what is coming. And the mechanism for all of this, of course, the greatest, is that we should love. Verse 21, he now goes on to say that creation is actually in a place of birthing, like a woman would give birth to a child. During those hours of labor, if you've ever had a wife that gave birth, or you are a lady yourself who have been through this, it's a near-death experience. Like it's traumatic. But the beauty that comes from that is so tremendous. I mean, in the metaphor that you kind of leave that behind and live now with the beauty of this child that, you know, is with you and that you see yourself in. And Paul in verse 21 to verse 21 and 22, he's basically saying that all of creation, and I include humanity under that because we're part of that creation. All of us are actually in the birthing channel, giving birth to something beautiful. He says it this way. He says the creation, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption. The word corruption here means decay, the actual decay of everything. Not sure exactly what that would mean. All I know is that sounds great. And once again, into the glorious liberty of the children of God. So here's the word liberty added to glory, a freedom that comes. This is also very much the expectation of the major prophets of the Jewish faith, that they were expecting a liberty in their projections of what Christians see as the Messiah, is the one who sets captives free. That somehow whatever Jesus had done would lead to liberty for humanity, but not only liberty for humanity, but glory for humanity, dignity, value, virtue, completeness. And that somehow all of creation is pulled into this vacuum or Venturi effect that humanity creates as it moves forward with God. And verse 22 says, he says, for all of creation groans and travails in pains until now. And so this all ties into verse 18, where he says that really the suffering won't be compared to what is coming. So I know what a lot of people do with this. I used to do this at some point. You know, we look at the world as it is and we say, okay, you know, the suffering can't be compared to what? To what we'll have once we did. To what we'll have on a planet called heaven. Once this whole thing is burned and it's gone, and then we'll have something more beautiful. But I don't think this is what Paul is saying here. He doesn't actually say that. In fact, he uses words such as time and travail. In other words, it feels rather like this world, this creation is in a process of becoming something else. Of becoming something beautiful, of becoming something complete. And we have the privilege of witnessing it, being conscious of it. I think this is why we need to be reading history. We need to know where we come from as humanity, not only church history, but human history. Understand the suffering that came, or that was present when we were still hunter-gatherers, or early on in our development, and understand how far we have already come. And really the truth is that what we're experiencing today, today's lifestyle, mentality, is a huge progression away from where we come from, as for instance, as I've mentioned, hunter-gatherer type of societies where suffering was rife. And today our lives, you know, we suffer mentally today, where our ancestors suffered physically in wars and etc. Okay, so the point here is simply then that Paul is trying to explain that whatever we are going through will be very well worth the end result. And this, you know, the hardest, oh, just knocked my whole glass over. The hardest question to answer in Christianity is suffering, of course. Why do we suffer? And how is it even possible that a good God would allow suffering? Now, I don't have answers for any of that. I don't. All I have is Paul's theory, which has become my theory, that it will be very well worth it in the end. That, as Paul says in verse 18, the suffering we endure will not even be worth comparing with what God is doing in humanity and through humanity into the future. So, moving on here, you've got everything is sopping way down here now. All right. So, verse 24, basically, verse 23, Paul also says, I'm not going to read it, but Paul also says, he says, look, not only is the whole of creation awaiting like this type of freedom from its corruption, its decay, but also even us, the part of us that's part of creation, which is very much like our body, and Paul then refers to the body, even itself is also awaiting some form of transformation. I don't want to say too much about that, but you know, the transformation of our biology is pretty much how we got here and how we are moving forward at the moment. But then verse 24 and verse 25, Paul makes it very clear to his listeners, and he is saying, look, we have hope for something that's not here yet. And he makes like a circular argument. He says, for if it was something we already had, we didn't need hope. But we need hope because what is coming is different to what we have right now. And then he speaks about the Spirit of God that bears witness in our own hearts. We don't know always what to pray, but the Spirit of God knows what to pray through us. And then he pulls into view a three-pronged or a four-pronged process. He says, God by foreknowledge predestined, elected, then justifies, and then glorifies. And I know very much that if you come from the Reformed tradition, which I do in my grandparents, Calvinism was quite rife, and I don't like Calvinism, and it's one of the reasons why I don't like Calvinism is Calvinism turns this portion into some small group somewhere in a corner. Like God, before we are ever born, he already decides, okay, you're going to be that, you're going to be that, you're going to, this is their words, you're going to hell, there's no chance for you, it's got nothing to do with you, it's predetermined. You're going to heaven, it's got nothing to do with you, it's predetermined. Like, I don't hold to that. I think the image of God has to have free will, otherwise it can't be called the image of God, and that's what we are. So I think this rather points to something much larger. It actually points to the purposes of God. The end result of God's purposes, as Paul just said a couple of verses ago, is glorification. In other words, it is God doing something in humanity, God turning the instincts of humanity, God turning that primitive self-preservation, survival instincts, that fight or flight instincts into love. Basically, I think that's how I see that, and that through a process. That comes because, and if you regress from glorification, we go back one step to justification. Justification is the key to this process, and this is why it's so critical. And I think this is why Jesus needed to come. I think this is why there is a Bible. I think this is why people are still talking about Jesus, because Jesus came to show us that God is different than what we thought he was. If we live by the old Torah, we live by the old covenant, the scriptures that we all have in the back of our Bibles, we get the picture, and to me it's an undoubting picture, is sketched by, for instance, a book like Deuteronomy, that God loves those who love him and he hates those who hate him. And if you cross him, you'll be destroyed, and if you like him, he'll bless you. That's what we get from the old covenant. But Jesus is not that. He doesn't think like that. He doesn't talk like that. He doesn't live like that. In fact, he preaches and teaches the opposite of that. No more condemnation. He says, love your enemies. Be merciful like your Father in heaven is merciful. And that is not just towards those who love God and who like God and who obey God. But mercy is for everyone, and grace really truly is for everyone. And so I think that's key, that we as humanity, we need to come to terms with the fact that we've been accepted regardless. Once we come to terms with that, we can actually start or we can walk into the light properly. And I think this is where we struggle. As a Christian, I've been a Christian for many years of my life. I've been a full-time pastor for 20 years of my life. I know this is where we struggle. And even if we theoretically say, okay, yes, great, we still live like we are not accepted unless we do certain things. We still live like we will not be blessed by God unless we do certain things. That's so deep in our psyche. We're struggling to get rid of that. We cannot accept grace as free or justification as a free gift. It just, our instincts go against it. But I think as we are people, as humanity, we are beings that have consciousness and that can change and transform. I think it's amazingly important, tremendously important that we do come to terms with this picture of God that we find in Jesus, because it's the key for our process into the future. So I want to end here with the last 4 or 5 chapters of Romans 8, and it's just beautiful, because Romans 8 1 to 8 is actually, it's summarized by 4 questions and 4 answers, which we find in verse 31 to 39. 4 questions, 4 answers that Paul asks. So once again, you have to read this not in isolation. You have to read it in light of Romans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Free justification for all. In the Spirit, part of the body of Christ, following after things of God, a free gift that's given to us. Then Paul asks these questions. He says, first one in verse 31 says, if God is for us, the first question, who can be against us? So in light of God's acceptance of us, regardless of what we are and where we are and what part of our journey we are on and what we did last night, if God is for us, who is going to stand against us? What? And this, you can hear Paul saying, like what? Like what? The government, the Roman Empire, the South African government, your mother, your father, your church, Satanists. What is going to stand against you when God has already chosen for you? And the great breakthrough in all of this is he's not talking to Christians. He's talking to everyone. He's talking to humanity. This is large scale. This is creation scale that we're talking about here if we read Romans 8 properly. If God is for his creation, which includes humanity, what's going to stand against us? What's going to inhibit him from doing what he envisaged to do? He says, he will give us freely all things. And this is the picture of God I think we as Christians we need to work towards. A God that freely gives all things. I think we struggle with this. Question number 1. Who can stand against us because God gives us freely all things? Who's going to do that? What's going to, what's going to stop this process? The answer obviously is nothing. Second one is verse 33. Second question. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? In other words, who's gonna come lay a charge against God's creation, against those who have chosen, against those whom God chose? Who's gonna come and say, "Oh, they bad"? Who's gonna come and do that? He says, and he adds as an explanation, it is God who justifies. Now, it's important to see this in terms of what we read in Romans 4, 5, and 6, that God, justification comes upon all. In other words, he is saying to us, if God says, I will embrace you regardless, if God is holding us, already embracing us and loving us with all of our sin, with our missing the mark, like, Who's going to bring an accusation against us? Now, I know the answer. We do it. We do it to each other, but it doesn't mean anything to God, and it shouldn't mean anything to us. But we do this to each other all the time. We bring accusations against one another. But Paul is asking the question, if God has already accepted you, and I want to ask you today, no matter who you are, no matter what you did last night, no matter what you're involved with, if God has already accepted you, if what I'm saying is true, that God already embraces and loves you regardless of who you are and in spite of what you've done, who is going to come and accuse you? Who? I see a lot of people walking around with only God can judge me. I used to think, I didn't like it in the beginning. Now I love it because that's the truth. Now, the third one is, who is he now that condemns us? You know, I always go back to the woman caught in adultery. Jesus, the Pharisees wants to condemn her. Jesus says, I don't condemn you. They're not going to condemn you. Everyone who wanted to condemn you, they're gone. Now I don't condemn you either. Go and do better. If God's not going to condemn us, who's going to do it? Who's going to judge adversely against us when he has already said, my children, my children, my children? And then he uses the confirming argument. He's saying, look, who's going to condemn us? Because it's the same Jesus that set that woman free. That's now, in Paul's metaphoric way of saying, he's saying, Jesus at the right hand of God, he's praying for us. Who's going to condemn us? No one, right? That's the answer. Number 4, and it's the last one. Now I'm going to end with this. And this, I think, is the point of Romans 1-8. To all Jews, to all Gentiles. He says, who will separate us from the love of Christ? Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? And then he lists them. Tribulation. Will tribulation separate us? Will distress separate us? Will persecution? Will famine? Will nakedness? Will peril? Will sword? In verse 37 he says, no, I'm telling you that in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Then he adds more. He says, I'm persuaded, not death, not life, not angels, not principalities, not powers. You know, here he speaks of governments, right? Nor the things present or the things to come. None of this can separate us from the love of God. Finally, he ends off in verse 39. He says, now no depth, in other words, no obstacle. No height, no obstacle, no depth, valley, hard place to go through. He says, not even any other creation can separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And so what a beautiful way to end the entire 8 chapters here in this last verse. The conclusion to all of this. This is the good news, and it's the unified theory. Nothing. The answer is simply, there is now absolutely nothing. Not your own mind, not your own deeds, not the judgment of your mother, your father, your Christian friends, your church, not the judgment of your government, not your own self-doubts, not your own death, not your own life, not your own hardships, not your own pride, not your own humility. There's absolutely nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And for goodness sake, this is not just for Christians. It has to be larger. This is about creation. This is about everything made. Because nothing that was made of its own choice or chose the condition in which it was made. God accepts everything. And I want to just say to those of you watching today, and maybe you struggle with self-doubt, and maybe you come from a Christian tradition where you were told that when you make a mistake, God becomes distant. Your prayers are hindered, you know. You're praying against the ceiling is what we used to say many years ago. I now know that there is no ceiling, that our acceptance is regardless. And there is no more anything, nothing, Paul says, that can actually ever separate us from a loving God. That's the beginning, that's the end, and that's where trust starts. So if anyone has faith, they can't have faith in what they believe about God. Like, you know, is he 3? Is he 1? Where is this? What percentage was Jesus God or what percentage man? Our faith is in this, that God loves us. That's true faith. That's a trust that whatever we're going through, he will help. He will finish the job. That's where our faith lies. Our faith lies in this, that we have been unconditionally accepted. That's the simplicity of good news, and that's exactly why it is also good news for everyone. God does not require allegiance or obedience for him to love us. He does not require sacrifice to forgive either. It is something that flows from him freely. And as we start to ponder this and make it part of our life and how we respond to God or think about him, let's also make this part of the way that we treat others. That we not become too judgmental, but that we would be freely givers of a love that flows truly from God but through us. Guys, I end with this. Nothing can separate you from the love that God has. Nothing you can do, nothing you can think, nothing that anybody else can do or anybody else can think. No more separation. Now, go and find who this God is. Go and love him and love others around you. Have a wonderful Sunday. We'll see you next Sunday. Next Sunday is the day after my race. I might not walk. I might have to roll in here and lie on the ground. I'm not sure. We'll see what condition I'm in, but all things okay. We'll see you next Sunday morning. Thanks, guys. Cheers.